And we're looking at the role of African cities tonight. African cities, especially South African cities, will experience massive migration in coming years, and this will put pressure on transport, housing, education, and a whole string of services.
So how can they avoid the pitfalls and become stronger engines of growth? To discuss, we're joined by the Deputy Minister for Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Andries Nel. He joins us from our studios in Cape Town. Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. What is the picture right now to start off with? Because we hear of people flooding into the cities. I know in Johannesburg, Cape Town, for example, it affects school placements, things like that. What's the extent of urbanization in South Africa right now?
Well, I think the starting point is that the world is urbanizing very, very rapidly. In 2050, or rather in 1950, only 1/3 of the world's population lived in urban areas. By 2010, already 50% of the world's population was living in urban areas, and that's projected to increase to about 66% by 2050. Now, Africa and Asia are two of the fastest urbanizing regions in the world. Between now and 2050, 2.5 billion more people will be living in urban areas. 90% of those 2.5 billion people will be in Africa and Asia. In fact, between 2020 and 2050, Africa is projected to be the fastest urbanizing region in the world. And South Africa is no exception. Already, about 2/3 of South Africans live in urban areas. By 2030, that should go up to 71%. And by 2050, 8 in every 10 South Africans will be living in an urban area.
Sure. It's incredible, Deputy Minister. If I can ask you then, we've got
when we
lots
talk about urbanization, we're not just talking about the big metropolitan centers. In fact, the fastest urbanizing areas are those secondary cities of 1 million and less. And also in South Africa, we find that areas that historically have been regarded as rural areas are in fact densifying and urbanizing very, very rapidly. There's an American academic, Mike Davis, who puts it very nicely. He says, not only is the peasant coming to the city, but the city is coming to the peasant. So when we talk about urbanization, we talk about an urban-rural continuum and the need to manage urban development and rural development as an inextricable continuum. I think the challenge that faces the world, and South Africa in particular, is how do we derive the upside, the benefits of urbanization, economically, culturally, socially, and how do we mitigate or avoid the downsides, congestion, very bad living conditions, environmental degradation. And it's for that reason that our National Development Plan devotes an entire chapter to the transformation of our national space economy, and why Cabinet in 2016, April of 2016, adopted an integrated urban development framework, exactly to give us an overarching policy framework, both for government as well as broader society, in how we manage urbanization. And very importantly, in managing urbanization, how we reverse apartheid spatial patterns, which are still very, very, very much with us, unfortunately.
Deputy Minister, so let me ask you about that spatial integration. At one stage, there were a lot of ideas, looking at Sandton in Johannesburg, of building social housing, of making sure that the rich didn't live in pockets and the poor living in their own pockets. What is the thinking? Where, right now, what is the thinking? Where do we want to go with that?
Well, the thinking is very simply that apartheid cities were constructed for a minority of their population. So you find historically that economic development, social services, recreational activities were all concentrated in the center, and the poor, the marginalized, black South Africans were pushed to the periphery of cities. Regrettably, in many instances, in the first 20 years of our democracy, whilst we've achieved huge progress in terms of basic service delivery, much of the houses and the services that were provided were also on the periphery. That has caused people to have to commute for many, many hours a day to and from work, to spend big parts of their income on transport. And what the Integrated Urban Development Framework and our National Development Plan saying is that we must redirect the development of our urban areas to be more compact, more connected. We need to develop along transport routes. We need to ensure that our cities become more dense, more compact, also that our development is much more integrated, that we don't just build houses without at the same time developing schools, recreational activities, clinics, courts, police stations, and other social activities, and that we at the same time give attention to the economic development of those areas.
There is one thing that I'm really interested in and perhaps concerned about, and we spoke about one of the pressures being transport. And I'd love to know your opinion. The taxis, recently we've been looking at the dangers for some women. They have no other choice. They often have to use taxis. And it's been said before, how can we say Johannesburg is a world-class African city if we do not have world-class transport infrastructure? Sometimes it seems like there's parallel enforcement, taxi operators deciding which routes, etc. And government's not involved in that. That government's not enforcing that. Have we as South Africa let this go?
I think you raise an extremely central and vital question. The Integrated Urban Development Framework, in many ways, is premised on a transit-orientated development model. So we say that we need to develop around transport nodes because that is vital in terms of getting people to work, to social, recreational, and other activities. Within that, we see in many of our metropolitan areas how those municipalities, with the assistance of national government, are putting bus rapid transport systems in place. In a city like Johannesburg, there is the Corridors of Freedom approach, which is trying through public transport nodes to link together those different parts of the city which previously were rendered separate and divided by apartheid. Of course, the taxi industry within that is something that we need to engage very, very critically. On the one hand, we need to ensure that passengers are safe and secure when they use those services. But I think the taxi industry has also raised some legitimate questions to say that in excess of 80% of commuters make use of the taxi industry. What percentage of our national revenue is being channeled to that industry by way of subsidies versus, for example, rail or bus? And I think those are very vital questions that we need to engage.
All right, I wish we could continue so many interesting aspects. Thank you for that perspective. This Africa Day, Deputy Minister for Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Andries Nel.